So I'm doing our welcome today, and so welcome. This is our fifth Take Action event. The Take Action event, or the Take Action series, is a collaboration between SIM South Florida, ISACA South Florida, and South Florida Tech Hub. Tonight we are discussing bias in technology. If those of you who went to the website, you might have read in the event description that I mentioned Star Trek, and I showed my fondness for the original series by mentioning Spock. But an example maybe more relevant to our discussion tonight might be Data from the Star Trek Next Generation series. As an android, Data was the epitome of artificial intelligence, yet Data was always trying to be more human. Only he wanted to be the best that humanity can be. I tend to read a lot of books about neuroscience and stuff like that. I find it interesting. And some of the things that I've learned is that humans rely on biases to deal with the huge amount of information that our brains process every second. Since we can only consciously process a fraction of that information, our brain uses biases that it's developed through our own experiences, through exposure to cultural messages. In the book Thinking Fast and Slow, we learn that there's a system 1, which is fast, intuitive, and emotional, and a system 2, which is slower, deliberative, and logical. And the biases, they live in system 1. So it's, this being the case, we can ask ourselves, well, if biases are, live in system 1, which is fast, intuitive, and emotional, and we think of computers and artificial intelligence as that logical and deliberative, how is it that biases are getting into our computer systems, our AI algorithms? And it really has to do with that we build it in, and it's not done deliberately, and in many cases it's not even done directly. For example, biases could have been introduced because we didn't have a diverse team, so we didn't even realize that we were not considering all the options, or we didn't have a diverse data set. So we didn't realize that we were training our AI using information that was incomplete. There are a couple of examples that are pretty well known. Voice recognition software. Since it was predominantly developed and tested by American white males, that would explain why Alexa understands my husband better than she understands me or my young son. Another example is that of there are two popular data sets that are used for training facial recognition systems, and those data sets have 79.6 and 86.2 lidar faces. So that's a pretty large percentage of the data set that is using not complete representation of the data that it needs to consider. So just as we address biases in ourselves by starting with awareness, we also need to be aware of the biases in technology. And I'm looking forward to Dr. Yelena Yesha's conversation, because she's going to kind of get into some of the technology and explain how this happens. So I'm excited to hear what she has to say. And I also hope that you'll find it enlightening, and you come away with some actions that you can do, that you can apply, even if you're not doing creating an android with pure artificial intelligence. Even if you're doing some machine learning or something more simple from that perspective, that we can figure out how we can ensure that we don't introduce more biases into our technology. So let me just give a moment to our sponsor, Kristen Bacon from eBiz. We're so very grateful to you for our sponsorship to help us make sure that this event is accessible.
You're very welcome. I mean, I'm really, my company, we're based here in Florida. We have an office in Ohio and also in the UK. And, we're LGBT and woman-owned business. So to partner with SIM and to sponsor these events is really important to me. I think that, as we've talked many times in meetings, that and especially this event here, there's a lot of bias in technology and also people working in the business. it's really, it's weighted, you know, again, to what we discussed before, to different demographics. And I really think that these events really spread the word about diversity and inclusion. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you. So, and I'm horrible at public speaking.
You're doing just fine. We appreciate your sponsorship and your support of the program.
You're welcome.
And just to let you know, Kristen also participates on our planning committee, and we're just very grateful for her support. All right. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Yelena Yesha. Yelena is the Knight Foundation Endowed Chair of Data Science and AI at the Institute for Data Science and Computing at the University of Miami. Dr. Yesha is also the Innovation Officer and Head of International Relations. Dr. Yesha was the founding director of the National Science Foundation Center for Accelerated Real-Time Analytics, which aims to develop long-term partnerships among industry, academia, and government. Dr. Yesha received her BSc degree in computer science and in applied mathematics from York University, Toronto, Canada, and her MSc degree and PhD degree in computer science from the Ohio State University. She has published 11 books as author or editor and more than 200 papers in prestigious journals and conference proceedings. And she has been awarded external funding in a total amount exceeding $45 million. She is currently working with leading industrial companies and government agencies on new innovation technology in the area of blockchain, cybersecurity, and big data analytics, with applications to electronic commerce, climate change, and digital healthcare. Dr. Yesha is a fellow of the IBM Center for Advanced Studies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Yelena Yesha, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you for kind introductions. Good evening, everybody. Delighted to be here. So what I will be sharing with you today, once Beth will put my slides on the screen, is basically a technology perspective on what exactly AI can do, cannot do, and where the bias actually coming into the picture. So in a sense, I'll be talking about managing bias in AI, and if the time permit, give you some flavor of how to proceed and how to avoid biasness, and specifically what we've done in our studies to mitigate the risk of biasness in the AI. Again, this presentation is high level, but slightly technical. It talks about the AI algorithms, about biasness in data, and maybe during the panel discussions after my talk, we can address actually the socioeconomic and racial and other gender issues that come as an input to the models that actually streamline and make us understand the bias. Next, please. Okay, so what is the sources of biasness? Like, we hear about biasness even before AI became prominent, and people were talking, this is bias and this is not bias, and how exactly we can control, mitigate, and define the biasness. So what I'll do today, again, very briefly, is define the bias as it exists in AI and talk specifically about one application, if I'll have time again, which is the healthcare. If you wouldn't have time, I'll bring some other results and ideas during the panels. We'll also talk about the impact of bias in AI, because AI is a very powerful technology, and nowadays it's starting to become part of everybody's life, using Alexa, as you mentioned, Beth, and many other places like smart and things of that nature. So what are the biases in AI, and how do we mitigate the risk of biasness? Because obviously, if you have too much biasness, then the whole story here will not be fully completed, or perhaps AI may create more damage than good if we are not using the correct data sets or algorithms for specific environments. Next, please. Beth, next slide. Okay, so what is the definition of AI bias? And again, I specifically said AI because, you know, there are other analytics that are not considered to be AI, you know, statistical methods, but I'm kind of overarchingly calling it AI. So basically, we can define it in a very kind of upstream fashion as an anomaly in the output of machine learning algorithms due to some prejudiciated assumptions made the algorithm development or during the training set generation, right? So we can basically talk about bias AI, where the AI system result in inaccurate or discriminatory predictions in output of certain subset of the population, meaning that we are not either inputting the right sample data or we are not creating our algorithms properly, so we can actually produce the proper predictions and have the right outcomes of our analytics. There are many articles that are written about this all around the world. This is not just the problem that is specific to North America or to our markets. We are working with United Nations. We are working with over 100 countries with the X-ray technology, and the biasness exists everywhere. And it's not, the most part, it's not intentional, as mentioned already from the beginning. It happens from the situations where we don't have the complete data set, or perhaps there are certain errors and misunderstanding of the models, or the algorithms are kind of off-the-shelf algorithms and they were not fully vetted and fully defined and triaged before they're applied to specific data sets. Next, please. Next slide, Beth. Okay, so what are the types of AI bias? So for the most part, from my experience, and I've been in this area for a number of decades, they primarily come from the biased data set. So it's like, you know, when the computer science started and I had the privilege to be at the beginning of this field, we usually used to say garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you don't put the right data for the training set, you're obviously out of luck, and whatever you produce as the outcome of this training and the algorithms is invalid, incorrect, or perhaps create the results that are unacceptable. We can also have biased algorithms, right? And these biased algorithms, again, produce all kinds of problems like inaccurate predictions, different computation, and perhaps can lead you to a wrong area of discovery, because AI algorithms is not the end to a certain task by itself. They're part of the big decision support systems or part of certain process that you are enjoying. Let's say if you're watching a real estate transaction, which is a long transaction, or you're doing some chemical reaction, whatever you are doing, it's not necessarily that you're applying single or sophisticated algorithms and you expect the problem. So here we're talking about the use of the AI systems that is incomplete. So all of this can lead to erroneous results, incorrect results, incomplete results, and this by itself is a big problem. Next, please. Okay, so there are other types of things that are a problem here. So the bias can enter different stages, such as objective is too narrow and technical without capturing richness of equity considerations, right? So in a sense, you're asking more than the data set can deliver, or perhaps the other way around, the data sets is too rich and the algorithms are not trained to work on such a rich data set. The data set used but not intended for targeted population, because nowadays, since AI gained such a big popularity, what is happening is people who are not computer scientists or trained AI specialists are using off-the-shelf tools, and many times effectively, and applying them to specific data sets without full understanding and appreciation of the power of the algorithm, but also without being able to triage and understand the quality of the data and the richness of the data that become part of the algorithms. So there are technical mistakes, there are accidental mistakes, and in many cases, there is a lack of access to the data. So while we have large data sets and the amount of data keep growing, the right type of data and what I call janitorial services of the data, meaning cleaning the data for processing for AI, is a very difficult and time-consuming procedure that requires significant training and resources. So if we are not going through this protocol and preparing and staging the data properly for triaging it and processing, then obviously we are not expecting to get the correct results. Next, please. Now, AI system usually used in different contexts and population, and they are usually need to be customized and streamlined for the operational use. Now, again, if these things are not taken into account and not properly done, then again, we produce either biased results, incorrect results, or we have a problem with the entire system producing wrong results. Now, sometimes algorithms themselves need to be triaged and scaled or properly implemented. All of these come into consideration. While the field is exploding, there is still lack of intellectual expertise. So this is another thing I would like to bring up to everybody's attention here, that while we have a very solid machine learning algorithms, we are still lacking a trained workforce that can apply this technology effectively and actually interpret the result properly. So to make kind of AI a total reality, or machine learning even, which is a subset of AI total reality, we do need a lot of intellectual expertise in addition to the algorithms and technology. So technology for the most part exists. What doesn't exist is understanding of how this technology needs to be used and how to triage the data, how to clean the data and stage it for the processing and get the proper results. And then of course, have an effective way of analyzing the results that we are getting as a part of the execution of these algorithms. Next, please. So what are the types of AI bias? And again, I kind of spend most of my time as a researcher in the healthcare domain for the last several years. So we have a real world patterns of health inequality and discrimination. As I mentioned before, we even started this meeting. I have a privilege to be one of the co-PIs on a $100 million grant from NIH of use of the AI for health disparity. So, and here we have unequal access and resource allocation. We have discriminatory healthcare processes. We have biased clinical decision-making. And more importantly, which I think where we start is the fact that we cannot and we do not democratize the access to the information in terms of the access to the healthcare. So while healthcare is not available at the same level to everyone, but even the information about the access to the healthcare is a privilege by itself, which leads to a lot of disparity and a lot of inequality in our society. Now, for the most part, this inequality comes from the economic environment, insurance industry, but there are other issues like access to the healthcare. Let's say people in remote communities, they will have to rely on telemedicine. Not all of them are technologically savvy. Not everybody are aware that this type of resource exists for them. So it's socioeconomic things, but also educational kind of background. So there are a lot of social programs that many people are not aware that would enable them to get an access to the healthcare. And again, I'm just giving healthcare as an example, but there are many other examples that have similar kind of pattern and problems. So how do we use this technology to enable and democratize the access to everyone in the same fashion? In this situation, we are talking about healthcare, but it can be food disparity, it can be anything as you can imagine. Even we have somebody here on that we just discussed real estate. How do we give complete information about the neighbors? How do you do search if this community is safe? If there is no people that are pedophiles or something like this, that again, you don't want to discriminate against them, but let's say if you are not computer savvy, you may not be able to get the complete picture about the neighborhoods, about the flood zones and things of that sort. So all this information needs to be democratized and available to the people. Next, please. Next. So what are the impacts of biased AI? So there are impacts that are very broad. So there are impacts on individuals and there are impacts on society. So the systems, if they're not used properly or designed properly, can unfairly allocate opportunity, resources, or information, or provide disinformation, if you will, that would limit certain individual society capability to do certain things. So we can have at a larger scale, at a societal level, when a checked AI system can actually amplify societal discrimination. For organizations, if we talk about healthcare, this can result in misdiagnosing certain patient group, gender, and ethnic minorities. And this is what I'm concentrating on, just try to understand if the same therapies are applicable to the general population, or perhaps there is a room, which we believe there is, for personalized medicine that is related to the gender, ethics, and minorities. A biased AI system can result in reputation costs for the companies. And lastly, companies that don't make addressing bias in AI a priority be liable to incur large penalty fees, legal consequences. And there are actually technologies that I'm coming across that looking at biasness in hiring, in HR, in how certain individual groups are handled in terms of being offered a job, but also how they're treated during their, tenure with the organization and promotions and ability to advance, as well as when departing the company, what kind of packages they get and things. Next, please. So we need to mitigate the risk of biased AI. And again, this is a very high level. This can be a course on its own. Those of you who are excited are welcome to come to Miami and pick up some AI classes, or just chat with me and others in my group who are working day and night on trying to understand and study these issues. So addressing bias in AI is obviously important imperative for risk mitigation. So at the organizational level, the challenges are present in how teams, organizations are set up, as well as the engagement with third-party developers and vendors of algorithms. I was talking to Kristen. She has a lot of shoulders in terms of running a consulting company. So how she puts the people together, how does she get third-party developers and vendors, how she makes sure all of this done properly to satisfy the customer, but at the same time, give preferences to any individual groups and things of that sort. At an industry-wide level, AI is rapidly growing where the frameworks are absent of only up and coming. So meanwhile, you have black box algorithm. There are also IP laws to understand decision-making process. Many decision-making algorithms, again, are black boxes, IP protected. So then the question is, are they biased? They give us the results that we would like to have. Who actually checked, and in what data set this kind of triaging of this algorithm has been performed? So on a broader societal level, we are grappling with historical inequality, power dynamics that are reinforced in data sets, teams, and decision-making authority, as well as navigating outdated educational things and fairness trade-offs that unfortunately still do exist. Next. So in mitigating the risk AI, and this will be my last slide, I'm already running out of time. So to minimize bias will be crucial in artificial intelligence is to reach its potential and increase people trust in the system. Because remember, while the technology exists, as I already mentioned, many people don't trust AI, don't trust the machines for different reasons. Some people believe that they'll take over and they'll mess with our brain and mess with our world. And some people simply don't think it's correct, and there are many kind of beliefs. So in order to mitigate the risk, first of all, we have to go through a number of steps. We need to be aware of contexts in which AI can help correct for bias and those in which there is a high risk for AI to exacerbate the bias. Establish processes and practices to test for and mitigate bias in AI. We need to engage in fact-based conversation about potential bias in human decisions. Fully explore how humans and machines can best work together, invest more in bias research, make more data available for research while respecting privacy, and adopt a multidisciplinary approach. Now, multidisciplinary approach is a must. And it becomes more and more important. And since I'm an educator for decades myself, one thing I can say that we are preparing next generation workforce, and next generation workforce needs elastic skills, meaning that people will be changing their jobs. And if in the 80s and 90s, people were looking for I-shaped people, meaning with a deep technical skills, nowadays people are looking for T-shaped people, people who are not just deep technically, but also have a diverse expertise and combination of several disciplines, and being able to apply it across different disciplines with the domain and knowledge. I'll stop here, and thank you again for invitation. Looking forward to our panel.
Thank you so much. Give me a second. I will change out our slides. Right. So as I mentioned, feel free if you have questions to post them to the chat.
Okay, should I go ahead at this point?
Yep, I was just scrolling to my notes, and yes, pleased to introduce Marilyn Rousseau, who will be facilitating the panel this evening. Marilyn is SIM's South Florida's Diversity and Inclusion Chair and leads the Take Action Planning Committee towards achieving our diversity and inclusion goals. Marilyn also works as the Corporate Manager Database Operations at Baptist Health. So welcome, Marilyn, and I will let you introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you. First, I want to start by wishing everyone a happy St. Patrick's Day. You can
Thank
see
you. Yeah, I have you agreed.
Yeah, so
nice.
you enjoy, hope you're all enjoying it. And I'm happy to moderate as we continue our discussion on bias in technology. And I am so excited to introduce to you our panelists tonight. We've got 3 panelists, and our keynote speaker will also be joining the panel. So let me go ahead and start with the first panelist. We have here Fred Bean. Fred is the founder and CEO of Rebel, and Fred will probably tell you a lot more about his company. So I just want to quickly move through. And next we have Rima Dio, who's joining us from 24/7 Security. Rima is the managing director there. And we also have Walter Shields, who's a data specialist. He's an educator, a best-selling author, and runs Walter Shields Data Academy. I want to welcome all 3 of you, and in addition to our keynote speaker, Yelena, as well, to the panel here. So let's just go ahead and get started. And I'm going to ask Fred, can you go tell us, introduce yourself and tell us about you, the work that you do, and your background?
Sure. Again, my name is Fred Bean. I'm the founder and CEO of Rebel Travel Corporation and Hotelport. We are primarily focused in tourism, hospitality, and, but in the technology space as well as entertainment. My background is pure technology and some marketing, but going back to 1994, I've had the fortune to be involved in many of the foundational projects that have laid the foundation for the current online travel ecosystem. So being involved in the launches of companies like Travelocity and Orbitz, TravelWeb, and which is a company that we sold to Priceline in 2004, and a number of others. So as it relates to technology and AI and artificial intelligence, it's part of our day-to-day operating environment and how we use it. We can talk about that a little bit more in detail later as we get into the use cases. But it's something that I think is extremely important. And in addition, I'm on the Chairman Circle of Miami Beach Chamber of Commerce. I helped founded the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council there as well. So this is something that is very near and dear to my heart. And when we bring technology together with diversity and inclusion, it's something that I definitely want to make sure that I'm contributing to.
Awesome. Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you. All right, let's move on to Rima. Rima, can you please introduce yourself and tell us more about you?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Yes, I have about 30 years of experience in information technology, and out of which 25 years, the first 25 years of my career were with Citigroup, a financial organization. And there I was responsible for a risk and compliance technology group for Latin America. So I did a lot of work with Latin America in those days, the 23 countries that we were responsible for. And in the last 6 years or so, I've been with 24/7 Security. We are a cybersecurity and compliance consulting firm. We offer advisory services to our clients to help keep them secure, to strengthen their cybersecurity posture. I have I have a bachelor's degree in commerce and a master of business administration, both from India. And since I came into the cybersecurity field, I went ahead and got a bunch of cybersecurity certifications because it's almost a requirement in cybersecurity. So that's something that I've been focused on. We are also, in addition to doing a bunch of work related to compliance, like with healthcare organizations, education, finance, etc., we are also working with Department of Defense suppliers or contractors, helping them get certified with the latest cybersecurity certification called CMMC. We are also PCI QSAs, that is Qualified Security Assessors, and I am one as well, and I have that certification as well. So I think I've gone basically from one male-dominated industry to another male-dominated industry, and as many of the women in this room might resonate with, I was often the only woman at the table, and I noticed very happily that started changing as the years progressed.
Absolutely, yes, thank you. And I look forward to talking more about that. Yes, so our next panelist here is Walter Shields. Walter, please introduce yourself and tell us more about you.
So hi, good night, everyone. My name is Walter Shields. I guess a little bit about me is I'm from a little island in the sun called Trinidad. Migrated to the US to study specifically computer science. Did that about 24 years ago. So I've been professionally in the field of data and data analytics for about 20 years now. I work for companies like MTA, NYK, Target Corporation, and Ropes and Gray, which is an international law firm. So in a lot of industries, and just really gravitated toward the data aspect of things. Somewhere along my career, I decided I needed to do a little more, felt like I had to pursue more passionate type work. So a big passion of mine is teaching. So I started a meetup group, flipped open a laptop in a New York coffee shop one day and said, hey, I'm the guy if you want to learn about databases and technology. The coffee shop was full. I ended up working with Citibank, which led to a book that I developed, which is now a bestseller. And I've now gone on to be working currently with LinkedIn Learning and some other companies like DataQuest producing educational material. So when it comes to diversity, as I mentioned a little earlier, maybe not to everyone, I'm a big advocate in terms of being able to speak to this topic. I really salute forums like this, and I really appreciate being able to be part of things, because I think the more vocal we are in educating each other about things like this, the further we're just going to get in terms of the progress that we make. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And we'll go back to our keynote here, Dr. Yelena Yeshai. We heard about your, list long of qualifications, but tell us a little bit about you.
Well, I was a refugee from the place that now called Ukraine about 42 years ago, and consider myself lucky. We immigrated to Toronto, and like we mentioned, undergrad in computer science, I was one of the very females at that time, undergraduate. When I went to grad school, the situation got even worse. But where the situation really got bad is when I was a 26-year-old professor teaching all male students, and they all were older than me because it was a graduate class and I was a 26-year-old professor. And this was really, and you know what, it took me 2 weeks to realize that I'm the only female in the class, actually, which was good, actually. But, you know, then when I realized it, I said, oh my God, what's going on? We need to change this type of situation. It is changing, but it's not changing at the rate that we need it to be changed. So there is a lot of problems there. I'm very passionate about promoting the woman in technology, women in computer science. But I'm also very passionate about the health disparity and food disparity, and trying to see how our technologies that we are developing collectively as a society can actually alleviate the needs of the people. Because in 21st century, to have people who don't have adequate access to healthcare or go to sleep hungry is unacceptable by taste. And there is no reason why these people cannot get an access. And it's not just the economic problem. I think it's a problem of information, problem of the society not spreading the information around. And this is where I believe technology, as I've discussed initially at my talk, and we can discuss over the panel, can play a pivotal role and make a huge difference in terms of changing the attitude and helping not one at a time, but rather masses of people at the same time.
Wow, thank you.
And if you want to learn more about me, there are 2 articles about me in Forbes magazine. So Google and Ayesha Forbes and wrote about my life and my story. So I don't know if you have time, but if you do, they're there online.
Yes, I'm sure we will make time for that. And Shoniki is going to drop it in the chat for everyone so we can follow up. But thank you for your contribution personally, as I just listened to you. I'm just so glad for people like you, really. So let's just go on with the questions. So the first question that I have is curious, you know, how is it that these biases in technologies have influenced you personally? You know, have you ever perhaps been faced with a situation, or what is it really that perhaps may have gotten your interest in biases in technology? And I'll start with Rima.
Okay. Well, I've been involved with a lot of discussions regarding bias, right, in the corporate world. And when I was at Citi, I was a founding member of a women's leadership council in the technology space. I did a lot of work with mentorship, etc. So that's somewhere where we always discussed where bias came in. And that was really related to unconscious bias mostly. But I believe that those discussions of unconscious bias are somehow related, are in fact largely related to what we are talking today, because as Yelena also mentioned, it's all about the data sets, right? It's what is the data that we are actually seeing, these artificial intelligence systems, the technology systems that are making decisions today, or screening or providing input to a lot of significant decisions that are being made in the world today are coming from historical data. And unconscious bias has played a big role in sort of filling that historical data and therefore creating a bias in there, right? So me personally, yes, of course, I can talk about unconscious bias and how it has impacted me. But since the subject of this panel is really technology bias, I think I may have been a victim of technology bias a few years ago when I was looking for a job. And I had about 20 years of experience. So I applied to a bunch of open positions that I believed I was well suited to. And I took a 2-pronged approach. One was through networking, through recruiters, through people I knew, tried to make champions, and went that route person by person, trying to identify, putting myself out there and saying that I'm available, I'm looking for a change. And the other approach was when I actually tried applying cold, right? There were certain jobs that I felt that, or rather I knew I would be a good fit for. And I just sent applications, sent my resumes and so on. Now through the networking side of it, it was pretty successful. I got a bunch of interview requests, I had offers, etc. But on the cold application side, and I had applied to quite a few positions, I didn't get even one interview request, not one. I think it might have been age bias because I had already had about 20 plus years of experience. So they knew, anyone reading my resume would know I'm at least in my 40s. Gender bias because I had the word women all over the place, right? I had the mention of the Women's Leadership Councils in my resume. Race bias because I had my studies, my education was, of course, from India. My name is very clearly non-Caucasian. So it could have been one of those or a combination of the three. But I believe that that was one area which was a very strong, where I saw very strongly that I think I might have been a victim.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, interesting. Okay, how about you, Fred? Has there been a time where you may have, what is it that has influenced you to be interested in biases in technology?
Well, much like Rima, I've often been, especially at the executive level in the various corporations that I've worked at, usually the only person of color in the room. And now that I think about it and reflect on it, there were probably no women in those rooms either. But some of the discussions that I would be a part of related to not only hiring practices and the way that certain groups of people, whether they're candidates, employees, what have you, were referred to or how they were discussed, it was clear to me that there was a need for varying perspectives in that room to make better and more effective decisions. And that was something that, the more that I started to elevate in the organizations, it was something that was more of a concern. And part of that was because of the fact that there was no one to mentor, there was no one to bring along and share that information with. And as we started to talk about technology and utilizing algorithms, whether they're weighted algorithms and other things related to AI, there were a lot of things that were overlooked that would be important to people that were like me, that came from where I came from. And so as I started to talk to more people and get more involved in various organizations, it was always something that I started to look out for. And then when things started to be utilized on the travel side and determining, how we were pricing product based on who the person was, where they were located, what type of computers they were using, those same algorithms and AI, from a methodology perspective, were started being used in other areas. And we touched on this a little bit in our pre-calls, but things like how it's going to be adopted for criminal justice, how it's being adopted for real estate, mortgages, loans, things of that nature. And so it's critically important not to only have those diverse opinions in the room at the creation level, but it's also important that everybody realizes and understands how these things work and what impact they may have, because we're all impacted by the AIs every single day, since we are all now access points. And so it's more important as every day goes by.
Great, yeah, thank you. And I just want to add, Rima, just listening to you brought something up. And as you mentioned, the biases against possibly about some of the items that were in your resume, I'm thinking in my case, I may have had an experience where it was the opposite, because my name doesn't really give off my ethnicity. I have a French name, and I often remember how, although I did get called several times, but I do remember seeing a little bit of a glance sometimes as to the name not necessarily matching the expectations. So that was an interesting point that you brought, and it really brought back memories. So thank you for sharing that. Walter, how about you? What has been your experience?
Okay, so number one, thank you so much. Those were some really great perspectives. And I've thought about this in terms of my own experiences. So I think it's been sort of technical as well as non-technical. So technical meaning from just dealing with large data sets, and now looking at a lot of the visualizations that are available today to process and make decisions basically on these data sets. AI is powering a lot of that now, like the key influencers, visual, for instance, in Microsoft's Power BI reporting system. That's now depending on AI driven decisions to make decisions that humans would have otherwise made. So it's already here. So I just kind of wanted to start with there in terms of what I face not so much a builder, but a consumer of AI. On another aspect, sort of non-technical, I guess my familiarity has been a little bit of what has been touched on by Fred and Rima already. Just being, the only Black face in the room. I mentioned 20 years of being in this industry, and pretty much all 20 years has been the same thing in terms of myself being the probably only or one of very few faces that look like mine in the technical space. And I think that's really where my career has been affected the most, because that's why I say, like, I really salute these types of forums, because even speaking about this now, there's a sense of awkwardness, like it's not that appropriate in the professional space or amongst my professional peers, such as you folks. So I think the ability to normalize that, because clearly there are issues that go into it. For instance, with AI, a lot of these training systems that do drive the way that these algorithms create their output, it would be a lot more diversely inclusive if that conversation started a little bit more normalizing the fact that, hey, there are other perspectives and other sort of balanced data sets that may be considered or should be considered that might drive some of these systems that are making our decisions already today. So I think that's sort of the way that I've been affected in those two aspects.
Yeah, that's a very good point that you brought that up. I agree 100%. And yeah, these are difficult conversations that, not everyone look forward to having, but yet I think it's important that these conversations be had, because that's how we are going to uncover, the missing link here in these systems that are being developed to think for us and to do certain things on our behalf. So good point. Thank you for saying that. Dr. Yelena, you talked about, biases that exist in different industries, but what really touched me was when you mentioned healthcare, because I work for a healthcare organization. Right. And, I heard you talk about some of the pitfalls of not having, of these biases in technology. And one of them had to do with, patient care, specifically due to the flaws were related to gender or ethnic differences. Has there been perhaps a particular instance that you know of, or an example that you could tell us about of when this happened, kind of to put it into perspective for us?
Absolutely. So we've done some studies on clinical trials. Before the drugs or device goes to the market, it has to go through the rigorous clinical trial process. And the way we set up the clinical trials and select the population makes a huge difference on the outcome, because it turns out in many studies that what works for, let's say, white Caucasian may not work for African Americans, what work for predominantly male population may not work for female population. So it's very important to come up with unbiased data set from the patients that will undergo clinical trials, and otherwise we'll end up having certain therapeutics on the market that would not be effective for specific part of the population. That's one. Nowadays, as you know, there is a big revolution in the healthcare from the patient perspective, but also from the perspective where we are marching towards digital health, right? So we have software as a device, we have software as therapeutics. For example, we are using music to combat Alzheimer's diseases. So there are all kinds of incredible technologies that's coming to the market. So the question is, what is the sample size? What are these patients on which we are testing this type of technology before it becomes a blockbuster drug, or before it becomes adopted by the clinicians and become part of everybody's care? Do we actually understand that it was really done in all the trials in unbiased type of fashion and not create problems? That's two things. The other thing is, of course, democratizing the access to the healthcare, because due to economic limitations or due to the geographic location, not every every person has the same information about the access. So it's not even getting the care, it's getting an information about access to the care that we are working on and trying to understand what is happening. And also bringing up the next generation of population. So for example, we are working with historically Black universities. We are working with National Network of Historically Black Universities and trying to educate the educators, train the trainees, because one of the things that I mentioned during my presentation is the lack of adequate number of professionals in the area. For every job in data science, there are 5 or 6 openings, so it's unheard of, right? This is probably the most hot profession in the universe nowadays. And it's not just in our country, it's not North America, it's all around the world. There are people from Israel, Europe. We're collaborating with them on the research, and they're saying our problem is lack of people with an adequate background. We don't produce them fast enough, and we don't produce the quality that is basically the knowledge base with these people that can actually combat this type of problems. Healthcare is definitely the area where biasness from the clinical perspective, but also from socioeconomic perspective, is a huge problem. And the other problem is food disparity that we started to look at, because there is not, well, there is a lot of food around the world, but there is not enough to go around to the right type of areas where people desperately need help.
Absolutely, thank you. And I see a message here quickly from Elizabeth. I just want to read it. It says the messages are not intended to place blame, but to provide assistance. So I don't know if there's any issues with interpretation, but let us know and we'll look into it. Okay, so
Marilyn, let me just jump in. So I know that I've heard the issue is that it seems like, you know, some internet connections maybe causing it to freeze, but I haven't heard from others that they're having the same issue. Earlier, like at the very beginning of the meeting, I had issues, but they seem to be resolved now. But certainly, you know, or certainly try to help if we can as far as, you know, issues with the Zoom, but unfortunately it is the world of Zoom that we don't have control. We don't have control over a lot of things in this world. So we're trying to help as best we can. You know, but that's.
And also reminding everyone that this meeting is recorded, so we will be sharing the recording as well, just in case you'd like to listen to it again, right? So, all right, so we move on to the next panelist here. So for Rima, you know, what, in your opinion, what are the greatest diversity challenges that either you've seen or you foresee in the technology world, any industry?
So I think I'd like to touch upon a little bit. This is more because I think it's not directly related to my area of work. However, it has been because I've been kind of close to this because the high school debate topic, the policy debate topic in high school last year was criminal justice reform. And Fred touched upon it as well. And my son, who's a policy debater, used to keep talking about this. So I just like to, so I kind of got interested in this area. And there are these sentencing algorithms in the criminal justice reform world where recidivism rates are assigned, right, to each convicted felon. So the recidivism or repeat offense rates are based usually on historical data. And what has been seen consistently over the years is that individuals who are tried and who need to be sentenced for whatever reason, they're often, the judges would define what the sentence needs to be based on the likelihood that they would commit a felony again, right? Would they be a repeat offender? And it was noticed that the system that many of these criminal justice reform or the criminal justice reform systems that many of the counties were using was very much flawed, because it was, again, using artificial intelligence to define or to calculate the recidivism rate. And sometimes using proxies to define again to make those decisions. And so it could be, for example, let's say a zip code, maybe that could, a particular zip code being a proxy for identifying this, for making this calculation, or a certain race, or certain calculations like socioeconomic data, the neighborhood you're from, whatever it may be. But ultimately, various reasons, and the algorithm was basically doubling the recidivism rate for African Americans. And worse, white offenders were actually getting off easier. So the likelihood was showing up as less for white offenders and double for Black offenders. So that's something that I think is really, really a significant impact. The other impact that I've seen is related to healthcare that I know Yelena is close to as well. But I saw once, for example, where let's say the same diseases, right? Again, talking about proxies, right? Because artificial intelligence uses systems use proxies, or they use certain data or samples to extrapolate the information. So if the cost of healthcare was used as a proxy, for example, to identify how much care you're going to need. Now, that's flawed in a way, because the cost of healthcare, who spends more on healthcare? Typically, people who already have insurance, people who use the healthcare system more. So it's typically people who are a little better or higher up on the socioeconomic strata. We also see that so wealthy individuals, the white community, typically uses healthcare more often. So a diabetic white person versus a diabetic African-American person, it seems as though through the algorithms, you'll see that the African-American person is actually healthier than the diabetic white person, whereas there's no need for that to be the case. I mean, all other things being equal, obviously. I just made an example of diabetes. You can have multiple variations, but everything else being the same, the minorities are shown to be at a disadvantage here. And I feel that some of these challenges that directly impact people's lives are significantly important, and that's something that we should take into consideration. And I'm hoping that from what I see, a lot of the companies are taking this seriously and they're taking steps. It's not going to be easy to fix. And I'm very happy that we have folks like Yelena working on this actively. So I think we can look forward to something better coming up soon.
Absolutely.
Let's
Yeah.
hope so.
Great. Great. Thank you for sharing that. Yes. So I'm going to turn over to Fred. How about you, Fred? What has been your view of the challenges in this area, and I guess share a little more of your experience with us?
Yeah, well, I think Rima hit the nail on the head. I think that's probably the most important or critical area, but every element of AI and how it's impacting various walks of life. Because from my perspective, AI, the whole purpose of AI is supposed to be to make unbiased, data-driven decisions. And one of the challenges I think that we need to take a look at, not to be too skeptical of things or negative, is that you always have to look at the worst that could happen, the worst possible outcomes with these things. And the ability to weaponize AI to bias the data purposely is a concern. So much of what we're talking about with the heavier weight on African Americans versus other ethnicities in a criminal justice algorithm, my initial question would be, well, was that flawed or was it working as designed? So those are some of the things that we have to be taking a really hard look at. And that's why I think transparency with the algorithms and the AI is key. Understanding what is used, what is weighted, and what the strategy for the outcome is supposed to be. What is the intent of that data? Because without that understanding, we're going to be walking into this blind. And part of this is more education and making sure that we have people that are learning about coding and AI in school, which right now that might mean an overhaul of the current education system, because we aren't cranking out developers and people that are educated in data science like they are in other countries, and that puts us at a competitive disadvantage. And so because it's becoming one of those things that has an impact on workforce, it has an impact on criminal justice, and also life in general, it's one of those things that we have to take a really critical, hard look at, ask the uncomfortable questions, and let the data lead us to where it leads us so that we can make the appropriate adjustments as we go forward. That's why Dr. Yesha's research and work is critically important. So I'm glad that she's here, because as we see these things continue to evolve, without that transparency of the people in the room, we're going to continue to run into these issues.
Great, thank you. And Walter, would love to hear your perspective on this.
Okay, so as I got a little more, I guess, prepared for this, one of the things that stood out to me that helped put things in perspective is bias. Such a word that is kind of guilty by default, but bias in itself is actually not a bad thing. Bias, as I've read, is just our brains taking a shortcut to patterns, right? So it recognizes patterns and it takes shortcuts, just trying to, be more efficient. The issue comes when you find an exception to that pattern. So let's say you were used to seeing a lot of small feet and then suddenly saw big feet, and you might say, wow, that's really abnormal feet. That's all well and good, but if you start now denying folks with big feet something that folks who have little feet enjoy, that's where we tread the line and we go into discrimination, which is what I think is the true issue, right? So part of what the greatest challenges for me is, in my experience, is when when I'm in a part of an organization where the leadership doesn't recognize this aspect as a critical metric in their definition of success as a business. I think it's treated sort of by the way a lot of times, and at least again in my experience. So one of the biggest challenges is getting leadership to adopt the attitude of purposefulness and a real targeted effort toward raising awareness, number one, amongst its workforce about just diversity and these different aspects. So then it's embedded in the culture of a place or a business, even if it isn't, well balanced. And I think, again, we said it a couple of times, but one of the screaming bits of evidence for this is, spending a 20-year career being the only face that looks like myself in the room most of the times. I mean, that's a statistic in itself that should be examined. So yeah, that's my take on things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can relate to that. Looking back at 30 years in technology, and not a whole lot has changed in terms of representation. And that's definitely an area that we could talk about for hours here. Moving on, with most leadership teams being primarily white and male, technical teams being also mostly white and male, companies have been told over and over that diversity lends to overall innovation and revenue generation, but we're still not seeing major changes. How do we work on getting our voices heard a lot more than it has? And we'll start with Fred.
That's, it's an excellent question. I've given that a lot of thought, because being a part of, major corporations and startups, dealing with fundraising and the various ecosystems that are involved, to a certain extent, it's about creating your own spaces, because you can't always be dependent on others to allow you access so that you can create the diversity that is needed within their organizations, which is effectively one of the reasons that I started my own company. Because breaking into those other sort of walled gardens, if you will, is difficult, if not impossible sometimes. And then you become the squeaky wheel, right? And then that becomes potentially problematic, and people don't want to deal with it, so they figure out a way to get you out of the discussion, or they'll entertain it and then have a separate conversation when you're not around, because they don't want to have to deal with all the other stuff that comes with it. So Walter touched on culture, and I think that that's critically important as well, in that if it's really difficult, if not impossible, to change culture in an organization, without just totally ripping out the guts and starting over. So if you're there from the ground up, I think it's much easier to do that. But I do think that creating your own space and making sure that we have the resources that are educated and understand that this is a space for them as well. Because part of what we've seen, I was reading an article about how Facebook was using the algorithms for ads. So if you were looking for a job and you were a Black man on Facebook, you'd receive ads mostly about maintenance or being a janitor or a garbage man or something. But if you're white, you'd be seeing senior management or executive positions. And that's just bias based on race and ethnicity. So I think that we have a number of challenges like that to overcome, but I like to be fairly aggressive. And I think that with the talent that's out there, it is incumbent upon us that have been fortunate enough to be in leadership positions to reach back out and get more people into the pool so that they have an opportunity as well, but so that there's also an ecosystem where we're creating our own spaces as needed and developing that culture from the ground up.
Great, thank you. So did we say, if we can either ask for our space at the table or get our own table, in a sense. All right, what about you, Walter? What are your thoughts on that?
So just to make sure that I'm aligning with the question, what the question is?
So the question is that with most leadership teams being primarily white male, as well as technical teams, companies have been told over and over again that diversity lends to an overall innovation and revenue generation, but we're still not seeing major changes despite the obvious benefits. So the question is how do we work on getting our voices heard?
Yeah, that's part of what I wanted to get out of tonight as well was a question like that answered as well. What I do think is, again, I think it comes back to the leadership. If the leadership is just not conscious, if this is not part of their metric or way of thinking in terms of what is needed to create success, it's going to be extremely difficult, at least in my opinion. I think I've had the experience personally where, just appealing to leadership to raise that sort of awareness within the company has fallen in, sort of deaf ears, which is why I kind of wanted to have some insight in terms of folks answering that sort of question as well. But I think the more that we have forums like this, I think the more that we have, just like folks like myself who might not, in my nature, maybe I might be like, hey, this is a little awkward to speak about, but folks like me who need to speak about this, because I do think about, the young man or young woman walking into a new position and having the environment and having the experience that I've had, and hope that they would have had an improved experience. And I think their experience does depend on us showing up and saying what we're saying right now, and just facing some of these challenges that we are facing right now, even though we may not know the answers right at the moment. I think just getting vocal, speaking up, talking about it, making it top of mind, even in environments that may not welcome you saying that. I think that's probably the way to kind of get our voices heard a little more.
Absolutely, thank you for that. Dr. Yelena, what about you?
Well, I think the one way, it's very difficult to change the culture and organization, I agree. But the other thing is we have to do it once we come from, in a sense, from underrepresented or community that doesn't have enough voice. So one way is to lead by example. And I imagine that during my career, to be honest with you, I don't think maybe once or twice I experienced kind of a problem with being female in the room. And actually this was done in a positive way once, I became full professor at the age of 32, and one of my colleagues came to my office, and instead of saying congratulations, he told me, despite the fact you're a woman and so young, you're really okay. Right? So which I didn't take as a compliment, and of course I made sure he regretted what he said. But I think you lead by example, and you create a change. You don't wait for the change, because the situation is so dire that you cannot sit and do nothing. So you have really to try to change, even by small inch, the organizational structure in a way, and not necessarily by claiming discrimination or doing things like that, but by rather producing results that would really takes you out of the norm and make you unique for organization. And this eventually would be recognized either in the organization you're in by promotion, or people from outside will notice you and try to bring you to the other organization. This is the only way I see how we can get out of this situation, because regardless of how many meetings we'll have and how much awareness we'll raise, it will be a very slow process, and we don't have so much time. As I said, there are 5 data science positions for every data scientist. And if we don't have females and people of color participating, their situation would become even more dire, and we cannot wait. So again, my slogan always in life: don't build bridges, jump. So you have to jump, and if you fall, you swim. But luckily, not always you'll fall, or you learn to swim and get to the shore. So you have to take chances. I don't advocate to be reckless, but I advocate to take the risk. The biggest risk is not to risk, right? So you take a risk, you take calculated risk, you do all kind of unconventional ideas, test them in business, in science, and then if you do it properly, you'll win. Long term, you'll win. That's the only way, in my opinion, you can succeed.
Great, thank you. I was just reading in the chat, someone here, Theta, she says we also have to start with education and training further up the pipeline, starting with children. And absolutely, I agree with that. Education is a big piece of making this better for everyone. All right, how about you, Rima? Any insights on your end?
Just something quick. Basically, I think, yes, what everyone said, I echo what the other panelists said, but also I think there is there are some options here as far as goals are concerned, right? If the executive team in a company has goals, diversity goals that have been set, they need to figure out how to actually implement. They're going to be evaluated on those goals. And I found that made a big difference. Well, big is relative, but that did make a difference in at least the thinking and the cultural side of it, as far as when I was at Citigroup. And every single person every single group, we had diversity goals. So you had to have a certain percentage, at least as far as the incoming recruitment, the pool that you recruit from, and then you had the diversity goals to establish. But at the same time, nobody was told to say, they weren't told, hire somebody because she's a woman or hire someone because they are colored. You have to hire the best talent you have for the job at that given point of time. The best way to do that is to increase the size of the incoming pool. Human resources has a big role to play in this.
Right. Yeah, thank you. That's a very, very good point. As we talk about this, yeah, there are definitely other aspects that need to be involved as part of this quest to make our workplace an equitable place for everyone. So thank you so much. We're nearing the end here, so I have one last question for you, and I'll just want to go around and ask each person, if you have any last minute insights or comments you'd like to share on the topic, or anything you'd like for the audience to know. Who wants to go first?
So Marilyn, I'm going to jump in only because we had 2 people mention some of the laws that are being put in place in Florida that are not helping our situation, right? So I would say another action you can take is go vote. Anybody who's not supporting, diversity, and, because as we've talked about earlier, that we know that having more diversity and appreciation for people with differences improves business, but that means it improves our economy. So, you know, if we're looking at it from a state level, you know, and we want to have a good economy, you know, we should not be supporting anything that increases the discrimination. And instead, we should be supporting things that, you know, promote more inclusion, more diversity, and more acceptance of all of our citizens.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think we learned, if we should have learned anything from the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, when everybody was getting homeschooled, it really illustrated that, or highlighted that there was a distinct difference between the haves and have-nots related to access to what should be a utility by now, being the internet. You had children falling behind because they didn't have access to computers, didn't have access to internet, things that many of us take for granted. And of course, only 14% of our population in Miami has voted. And therefore, you can't really get people in place that are worried about infrastructure to make these things more accessible so that we can increase the education to make sure that those pools are available for human resource departments so that we can actually have more people that are available. I do think that there's still a great opportunity. Technology should be the great equalizer that we have to move things forward. But I think that more BIPOC people need to see themselves as being able to be successful in these roles and opportunities. And I think that every conversation like this, every person like Walter, like Rima, like Dr. Yesha, that is successful and participates in forums like this, gives somebody something to look up to and potentially emulate so that we can have more people in those spaces or creating their own spaces. But all of it, to me, is related. So when you talk about what's going on with the legislation, what's going on with the things in the boardroom, it's all something that we've got to continue to move forward with. And organizations like this are extremely important in making that happen.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
I guess the only thing that I would add, I just kind of want to echo that comment on education. It's actually really stood out to me because I think it's just really important that more faces like ours show up in the educational space, because that's going to be a really big anchor, as I've heard personally myself from a lot of students and people who are potentially wanting to make a career happen in this space. It's such a much more welcoming face to say like, hey, you know what, I see myself there because, hey, you're already there. So just showing up in this space in all the denominations that we all represent, I think that will be such a big factor in evening some of the odds that we see out here today.
Great. Thank
And
you.
I should have mentioned LGBTQ as well. So BIPOC and LGBTQ, because we're all in that together.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when it's interesting when we talk about diversity, first thing we tend to think of gender, color, but it's so much more. And absolutely, you know, sexual orientation, religion, there's so much more dimensions to this topic. So yes, thank you for that.
Absolutely. One last thing I would like to mention, being a technology, is that perhaps the same technology that combats unbiasedness can be actually used to promote diversity and promote actually and help people of color and different sexual orientation and other groups. So in a sense, we should make sure that we are coming together as an ensemble of tools to combat the problem rather than just one or two. So it's education from elementary school, from K through 12, to use of the technology, serving by examples, democratizing the access to the information. There are so many things that we can do. And of course, legislatures that needs to be passed there as well. And also build competitive environments, encourage people to compete effectively and not be afraid. That's the point I want to make. Don't that you are disadvantaged from the get-go because you're a woman or because you're a person of color or anything else. You are the same like everybody else, just go get it, right? So we have to build the spirit.
Great, thank you for that. Yes, and Rima, anything you'd like to add before we close?
Just basically The only thing that I can think of is considering, we were talking about bias in technology. You did mention that technology groups are also largely white male oriented. The only thing I can say is we really, for AI, for the purpose of improving our algorithms and for improving the testing, et cetera, it's so critical. I mean, this is not an option, right? It is critical that they be more diverse teams, not only, I mean, right from the design stage, the development, and even up to testing. We've seen so many examples in order to actually make AI more effective. So companies don't have a choice there. The only thing is, do they have a large enough talent pool to choose from? And so that's where what the other panelists have said really is important, to stress the importance of this right from K to 12. Let's get those kindergartners and teach them AI.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, it sounds great. Oops, I think, yeah. It all sounds great, and I believe it. It starts from a very young age with creating this culture of inclusivity from elementary school. And so thank you so much. This has been a really enlightening really time for me. I've learned so much from each of you as it relates to biases in technology. I'd like to take the time to thank you for your contribution, for your time. We could go on and on about this. And I think it was Walter that said something about this particular conversation is really what needs to continue so that we can talk about these challenges and how to tackle them and how to find solutions to them. So I really hope this has been a beginning. We're definitely looking forward to having more of these conversations. So if there are any particular topics you'd like us to research and find speakers for, please send them our way. We'd love to really help educate. That's what we're here for, is to educate the community, educate ourselves, and make the world of technology better for us all. So we welcome your feedback. We hope that you've enjoyed the panelists here. I certainly have. Again, I want to thank you. And we're going to move into the next segment, which will be breakout sessions. So I'll let Elizabeth come and tell you a little bit more. But again, I want to thank you all for joining us. And particularly, I want to say thank you to BizEdge, our sponsor. Thanks again, Kristen, for sponsoring this really amazing event. So thank you, all of you.
Thank you so much.
All right, so we're going to do breakout rooms, and I'm just going to share my screen briefly. We're going to have 2 breakout rooms that will enable us to, have smaller groups that we can talk with. You see here, I've kind of assigned the speakers to one of 2 breakout rooms. I'm going to pop it up in a minute. For the speakers, you'll select the breakout room that I've identified for you. And for the participants, choose the breakout room that you would like to go to. I'm going to put it in the chat as well. But if you need the ASL interpreters, they will be in breakout room number 1. Let me just do that real quick. Right, and so I'm opening the rooms, and I will stay here in the main room. That way, if anybody has any trouble, just pop back into the main room, and I'll help you out where I can. And I think we're good to go. So enjoy the conversation. I will kind of bring you back 5 minutes before, or 5 or 10 minutes before the end, so that we can close out and wish everyone a good night.
I don't have any message or anything that has popped out to select a breakout room.
Let me
see if you have something at the bottom that says.
Yeah, I see it. I see it now. Now I got it.
Okay.
Oh, you do? I don't see it.
In the bottom right toolbar, you should see like 4 little square boxes that make up another larger square that says breakout rooms underneath it.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
2. We got pulled out of the conversation.
Totally pulled out of that one.
Yeah,
We
same
weren't
here.
done, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I apologize. A little bit shorter than we thought. I would say if you think you can finish it up in 2 or 3 minutes, then we should have time to continue the conversation.
We were having a good talk there.
Yeah, we were.
No, but Kristen, your point that you were making, I think was a good one.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, we were just kind of talking, we talking about the LGBT community. It's like, that's a lot of letters. And the community is not really one cohesive community all the time. And so a company might put up a pride flag and say, okay, great, we're LGBTQ, committed, but I've got my gay white IT director, but they might not hire somebody who's gender variant, and they might not hire somebody who's lesbian, or they might not hire somebody who's, non-binary, and that's it's a common problem that we see. Back to making your own space. I've made my own space, and I've brought people with me, and that's the way we change. And my clients, I represent in my community probably 5% of the population. It's that small. And particularly in my section, 0.1. Okay, it's that small. But my client is 95% of the United States, okay, or the world. And so my client, I show up, and that's my responsibility, is to show up in that 95% and represent. And I think that's a big issue as well, because some people are afraid to do that. They stick within our own community and they hide. No, my client's that 95%, and I'm not afraid to go out there. So
I think that, I think Marilyn mentioned something earlier about, we were talking about education and feeling safe, or that you belong in these spaces. And that starts from childhood. I mean, I can't tell you how often I was told that I couldn't do this, I couldn't do that, by teachers and guidance counselors and people that were saying, yeah, you're Black, you're not going to be an executive, you're not going to do this. Think about playing football, be an entertainer, stuff like that. You start to believe that stuff after a while. It's imprinted on you, and you grow up, and your expectations, it's the soft bigotry of low expectations. And that's something that, we have to start at the grade school level, so that these children believe that they're going to be the next, Mark Zuckerberg or whomever, in any sort of orientation or gender or color that we are. So we've got a lot of work to do. It's definitely not an easy process. I think that like we were saying earlier, the more people like us that continue to contribute to these conversations and participate aggressively in this space, the better it will get. It might not be within our lifetimes that we see the full benefits of it, but at least the generations after us will continue to move the ball forward until we get to that point.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think the more visibility, the more we have these discussions, so that people become aware of these biases that exist in all of us. It's really becoming aware of them, so we know which ones perhaps don't serve us, or has a tendency of pigeonholing people, and to be aware of learning to reverse that mindset. And I think it's from that point that we'll start seeing it really escalate into the systems, because now the people who are doing the design and development are very much more aware of these biases, and therefore can really be mindful in the development phase, in the design phase, to make sure that these somewhat unconscious biases are avoided.
Agreed.
All right. Well, sounds like you guys had some great discussions. I think our next step is closing remarks. And Marilyn, who was going to do our closing remarks?
Nikki.
Hi, I don't know if you guys can see me. Can you guys see me, or I don't know if I'm spotlighted or not, but So my name is Nikki Caboose. Oh, there I am. Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. So I'm the CEO of South Florida Tech Hub. I wanted to say first that we are, proud partners of SIMS and ISACA South Florida as well, to do another one of these Take Action events. We've been trying to do them at least once a quarter. We've had a lot of important discussions, so hopefully we'll be able to have all of you that attended tonight come back for future discussions as well. One thing that I did want to kind of summarize that I took out of this conversation, just in closing remarks here, that I'm sure if we had another hour, we'd continue to talk about all of these topics. But the one thing that I caught, Fred, that you were saying there, even at the end, was that a lot of this starts when we're very young, right? It starts with the representation. And if you're told as a student, you're told very, very young, that's going to stick with you and you start to believe it, right? So I think one of the ways for me that we can start to break that is you're always going to have the naysayers. You're going to have the people that tell you can't do things, that you don't look a certain way, you're not smart enough, you're not whatever. I mean, even for me as a white female, I deal with imposter syndrome all the time, and I'm very open about it. And I've talked about that before. And for me, I think one thing that everybody can do, no matter what your role is or your title is, whether you're leadership or not, is getting involved with organizations as a volunteer, like Boys and Girls Clubs, Junior Achievement. Junior Achievement is a great organization, no matter where you are in South Florida. There's one in Miami, there's one in Broward, there's one in Palm Beach, Martin County. And they have a bunch of wonderful STEM programs, entrepreneurship programs, where you can literally, even if you can't go in person, they do it virtually and in person, where you can get in front of a lot of these students and talk about your journeys, talk about what you do, the differences that you're making out in the community and what you're doing, in your career and your journeys, because the students need to see more people from diverse backgrounds, racially, culturally, gender. They need to see that to know that they can do it. So even if there is those naysayers there, if there's 10 other people telling them don't listen to that person, then they're going to start to believe in themselves. So I would definitely say get involved in Junior Achievement or other organizations like that. Also, is really quickly, because I know we're right at time, another organization, and I'm sure there's other organizations like this in South Florida that I've gotten involved with, and Tech Hub, our organization's gotten involved with, is Path to College. Path to College, if anybody's not familiar, they're a nonprofit based in Palm Beach County. They deal primarily with underserved and underprivileged students, but that are very smart, get very high SAT scores. They graduate top of their class. I'm talking high schoolers, right? Graduate top of the class, but they just do not have the funds or resources to go to college. These are the future scientists, the people that are going to, eradicate cancer. They're going to do wonderful things, but if they don't have the same opportunities, we're never going to see that. So again, this is an organization that's helping these high achieving, Black and Latino students get into great universities and have a step, in the right direction. And why I'm using them as an example is because we recently, as an organization, got involved with them. And we had, just a couple weeks ago, we had about 40, 45, mostly Black, a couple Latino students in a room talking about STEM. This is what the STEM industries, what they are, the different types of career you can have. Here's a little bit about coding. We even did an intro to coding class where they got to code for the first time. I think there was only two students in the room had ever been introduced to STEM before. One of them had coded before. And there was one Black female afterwards that approached us. So I think we actually got a video of her on like TikTok or something, that she was saying, I had no idea that the tech industry was primarily middle-aged white men. And she was like so excited. And she was like, I want to take over. I want to get involved. I want to join STEM. And she had, she just didn't know. And most of the students had no idea that these type of careers even were available to them. So that's my closing remarks. I just wanted to say there's definitely more than enough ways to get involved and volunteer. And if this is something that you are very passionate about, I'm sure myself or Marilyn or Elizabeth or any of the panelists can connect you to different K through 12 organizations or higher education institutions or organizations that have these STEM and entrepreneurship programs that are primarily for underserved and underprivileged students, so that you can start to be the change that we want to see. So that is my closing remarks. I just want to say thank you all to the panelists, to our keynote, Dr. Yesha, also, of course, Kristen, thank you for sponsoring with BizEdge. And Elizabeth, I don't know if you've got any remarks to close this out, but I just wanted to say thank you for everybody showing up tonight.
I am good. Yeah, I think you did a great job closing it out. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone who attended. Appreciate the participation, and we'll try to get the recording out for this as soon as we're able to. And we just try to make sure that everything looks good on the recording as far as captions and things like that. So be on the lookout for that. And again, thank you all for coming. Have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Night.
Night. Thank you.